The House chamber hummed with subdued tension as Representative Jasmine Crockett approached the podium. The C-SPAN camera tightened its focus on the first-term Democrat from Texas, her braids pulled neatly back, wearing a striking purple suit that cut sharply through the sea of navy and gray on the floor. High above, Speaker Mike Johnson sat rigidly in the chair, eyes flicking to his phone, appearing unbothered by the 5 minutes of floor time granted to the famously outspoken Congresswoman. "Mr. Speaker," Crockett started, her voice steady and measured. The room hushed as her words commanded attention. "Today I rise not as a Democrat speaking to a Republican, but as an American addressing a profound breach of public trust." Johnson glanced up for a moment, his face a mask of practiced calm, then returned to his screen. To him, it was just another partisan speech. He gave a faint nod and looked away again. Crockett pressed on, her tone growing firmer. "Last week you stood right here and told the American people that the new border bill was crafted with, quote, full transparency and unprecedented bipartisan input. I hold documents that don't merely dispute that claim, they expose a deliberate pattern of misinformation delivered to members of this body." This time Johnson looked up fully, his brow creasing. Conversations nearby halted as members turned toward the podium. "These documents," she continued, raising a folder stamped with the House seal, "demonstrate that the final bill was secretly altered after committee approval. Critical enforcement sections were stripped out and new loopholes inserted without notifying the minority members who negotiated in good faith." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Johnson set his phone down, straightening as GOP whips began weaving through the aisles, whispering urgently. "Yet what troubles me most," Crockett said, slicing through the rising noise, "is what these papers reveal about who actually authored those changes." She paused, her gaze fixed on Johnson. "Mr. Speaker, care to explain why entire passages of this legislation contain verbatim text from private industry lobbyists, text you personally certified as written by staff?" Dead silence fell. Johnson's face drained of color as he motioned toward the parliamentarian. Cameras swung between Crockett's unflinching calm and the Speaker's obvious discomfort. "Point of order, Mr. Speaker," the Republican Majority Leader shouted, attempting to break in. "I have 4 minutes and 20 seconds remaining," Crockett replied evenly, "and I will use every one of them." What happened next would send shockwaves across Congress and tilt the balance of power in Washington. Voiceover: "Before we dive into the evidence Representative Crockett laid bare, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep-dive political coverage that exposes what truly goes on inside the Beltway." Jasmine Crockett didn't arrive in Congress planning to play by the old rules. A civil rights lawyer before her 2022 victory, she had spent years honing meticulous preparation and an unflinching demand for accountability. While most freshmen spent their first term learning the ropes, Crockett stood out immediately for her research-heavy style and readiness to confront power directly. "She treats Congress like a courtroom," her former law partner told the Texas Tribune. "She collects the facts, builds the case, then delivers it without apology, no matter who's in the defendant's chair." Progressives admired her, conservative media branded her aggressive. Her now viral CNN clapback said it all: "When men are direct, they're effective. When I'm aggressive. I'll stay aggressive for the voters who sent me here." Across the aisle sat Speaker Mike Johnson, elevated to the gavel after Kevin McCarthy's ouster. The Louisiana Republican presented himself as a calm, faith-guided conservative who could unify a fractured conference. His polite demeanor and reputation for civility won early praise. "Johnson brings back civility," Sean Hannity proclaimed the night he was elected. "A constitutionalist who believes in transparency and honest debate." 7 months later, that image was cracking. Moderate Republicans grumbled privately about being sidelined, Democrats accused him of reneging on deals. The border bill at the heart of this clash had been Johnson's proudest bipartisan win. After months of stalemate, it passed with support from centrists on both sides, and Johnson spent the next week on every cable show celebrating it as proof Congress could still function. What the public didn't yet know was that serious questions had emerged about how the final language was produced, and whether promises made during negotiations had been honored. The stakes stretched far beyond one piece of legislation. With midterms looming and control of Congress up for grabs, any proven breach of the Speaker's integrity could rewrite the political story. For Republicans, charges of deceit struck at the core of their "drain the swamp" branding. "This isn't just a policy dispute," Melissa Harris Perry noted that morning on MSNBC. "It's about whether the legislative process itself remains trustworthy." For Johnson, the personal risk was enormous. his entire brand rested on faith, honesty, and trustworthiness. Credible evidence of deception could torpedo both his agenda and his reputation. For Crockett, the gamble was equally high. Directly accusing the Speaker on the House floor with explosive allegations could either catapult her as a champion of accountability or leave her exposed if the evidence didn't hold. Tension hung thick in the air. GOP members huddled around Johnson, whispering strategy. Democrats watched intently, knowing the next few minutes could define the moment. As Crockett prepared to present her proof, everyone grasped the gravity. A freshman congresswoman was openly charging the Speaker with misleading the entire House. It was the kind of episode that could vanish by the next news cycle, or permanently change expectations of political accountability in Washington. Johnson fidgeted with his tie and leaned toward the parliamentarian, perhaps searching for a procedural lifeline. But before he could move, Crockett continued. "Before we examine the altered text itself," she said, "let's first set the context that makes these changes so alarming. I direct the chamber's attention to Exhibit A." Aides began passing out documents. These are the official minutes from the final bipartisan negotiation session on the Border Security Act, dated precisely 2 weeks ago. She projected a highlighted section onto the screens. Page 3 records Speaker Johnson's personal assurance, and I quote, "No substantial changes will be made to the enforcement provisions in sections 4 through 7 as agreed upon by this working group." Every Democrat and Republican on that working group relied on that promise when choosing to support the bill. C-SPAN cameras panned across members hurriedly flipping through their copies while Johnson conferred quietly with the parliamentarian. Yet, Crockett went on, the enrolled bill contains 17 significant alterations to those exact sections. These are not minor tweaks or technical corrections, they are substantive changes that dilute enforcement and insert exemptions never raised in bipartisan talks. A side-by-side comparison appeared on the screens. For example, Section 4, EB3 originally required compliance verification within 30 days. The final version stretches that to 180 days with unlimited 90-day extensions, effectively gutting the accountability timeline moderate Democrats insisted on before agreeing to vote yes. Murmurs swelled on the Democratic side. Moderates who had supported the bill were seen huddling with staff, jabbing fingers at pages in clear frustration. Johnson rose. "Point of order," he said tightly. "The gentlewoman from Texas is mischaracterizing routine legislative refinements and imputing bad faith where none existed." "I appreciate the Speaker's clarification," Crockett answered coolly, "but let's proceed to Exhibit B." New documents flashed up. These are emails between the Speaker's chief legislative aide and the Border Industry Coalition, a lobbying group for private detention contractors. Johnson's jaw tightened. This message, sent 3 days after the bipartisan agreement and 2 days before the final draft dropped, includes an attachment titled Proposed Modifications to Enforcement Provisions. When we overlay that lobbyist document onto the final bill, 15 of the 17 changes match word for word. The chamber exploded. Democrats leapt to their feet, Republicans clustered in agitated knots. The presiding officer pounded the gavel repeatedly. Representative Jim Jordan strode toward the well, ready to intervene. Crockett raised a hand. "I still have time, and I will use it. The evidence is not finished." Jordan retreated. Then came Exhibit C. "This may be the most damning document of all," she said. A text exchange appeared on screen between Speaker Johnson and the president of the Border Industry Coalition, sent the day before the final text was released. The Speaker's message read, "Changes implemented as discussed. Dems won't notice until after passage. We'll call you after the vote." Silence blanketed the room. Johnson went ashen. Democrats stared in shock, even some Republicans shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Speaker," Crockett said, looking straight at him, "would you care to explain to this chamber, especially to the Democratic members who supported this bill in good faith, why you publicly promised no major changes while privately coordinating with lobbyists to get key enforcement sections?" Johnson stood again, voice strained. "These allegations are being taken out of context. Those communications were normal stakeholder outreach to ensure the law could actually work in practice. No promises were broken in spirit or letter." "The evidence suggests otherwise," Crockett countered calmly. She threw up a split screen, the bipartisan agreement, the lobbyist proposals, the final bill. "These aren't interpretations. They are direct, side-by-side comparisons. The very enforcement tools that earned bipartisan buy-in were quietly neutered at industry's request, without notice to the members who negotiated them. The gavel hammered as members from both sides shouted to be recognized. "I have 1 minute remaining," Crockett said over the chaos, her voice unshaken, "and I intend to use it to explain why this matters." The room gradually quieted, every eye turned to her. "This is not about policy disagreement," she said, clear and deliberate. "It is about whether this institution can still operate with integrity. When members cannot trust that agreements reached in good faith will be honored, the House fails. When private interests can secretly rewrite legislation after bipartisan consensus, we cease being representatives of the people." She turned to address the full chamber. "I came here believing that, despite our divisions, the integrity of this process was sacred. Today I ask members of both parties to prove that belief still holds." As if perfectly timed, her 5 minutes ended the instant she finished speaking. The presiding officer, visibly rattled, announced, "The gentlewoman's time has expired." But everyone in the room, and millions watching at home, knew something far weightier than 5 minutes had just concluded. For several seconds, silence reigned. Then the dam broke. Democrats rose in applause and demands for answers, some called for an immediate ethics probe. On the Republican side, leadership circled Johnson while several moderates stood apart, studying the documents with growing unease. The gavel pounded futilely. "The House will be in order." Majority Leader Steve Scalise was recognized. "Mr. Speaker, I move that the House stand in recess subject to the call of the chair." Before it could proceed, Democratic Leader Hakeem Jeffries jumped up. "Objection. The House deserves an immediate response to these grave allegations. The Speaker must address this body now." Amid the procedural chaos, Johnson walked to the well, signaling he would speak. The chamber hushed. "I welcome the opportunity to respond," Johnson began, steadier in tone than in appearance. "What Representative Crockett has presented is a selective and distorted narrative. The revisions were technical adjustments made to preserve our bipartisan agreement while ensuring real-world enforceability. Stakeholder input is standard practice. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was done in bad faith. If any confusion arose, I regret it, but there was no intent to deceive. It was a polished defense, perhaps enough in ordinary times." But Crockett, still at her seat, silently held aloft the text message again, "Changes implemented as discussed. Dems won't notice until after passage." Johnson faltered mid-sentence, his words colliding with the evidence on every screen. Then Representative Don Bacon, a moderate Republican from Nebraska, rose. "Mr. Speaker, point of personal privilege." His voice carried institutional gravity. "As someone who worked on this bill in good faith, I must ask, are Representative Crockett's documents authentic? Did you assure the bipartisan group no substantive changes would occur while permitting industry lobbyists to rewrite enforcement sections?" Coming from a Republican, the question landed like a bomb. Silence followed as all eyes returned to Johnson. He scanned the chamber, from loyalists to the growing number of uneasy faces on both sides. "The communications did occur," he said at last, voice lower, "but they lack full context. The revisions fell within my authority as Speaker." A collective gasp swept the room. It wasn't a confession, but it wasn't a denial either. Bacon stayed standing. "With respect, Mr. Speaker, authority is not the question. Trust is. If bipartisan agreements cannot be relied upon, how does this body function at all?" More Republicans visibly distanced themselves from leadership. What started as a 5-minute speech had spiraled into a full-blown leadership crisis. Seizing the shift, Jeffries rose again. "Given these extraordinary circumstances, I move to establish a special bipartisan committee to investigate the Border Security Act allegations and report within 14 days. In a stunning moment, Don Bacon immediately seconded, "I second the motion and urge my Republican colleagues to support it." If we truly value transparency and integrity, we should embrace the chance to uncover the full truth. Johnson stood frozen as his authority eroded in real time. Crockett spoke once more, calm and devoid of partisanship. "This is not about party. This is about whether agreements across the aisle still mean anything. Every member here, regardless of letter, has a stake in protecting that basic trust." Her words landed with clarity that cut through the tension. Lawmakers from both sides nodded, briefly setting aside tribal lines to acknowledge a threat to the institution itself. As leadership huddled with the parliamentarian, cameras caught Johnson sitting alone at the desk, his physical isolation mirroring his political predicament. Within minutes, clips of the text message and Johnson's faltering response were everywhere online. A routine 5-minute floor speech had become one of the most consequential congressional confrontations in years, raising not just questions about one bill, but about the trustworthiness of lawmaking itself. The fallout spread fast. Within an hour, Johnson exposed, and Crockett receipts trended nationwide. Networks broke into programming. Jake Tapper called it one of the most significant congressional showdowns of the modern era. Former House parliamentarian Charles Johnson told MSNBC, Representative Crockett produced documented evidence that the Speaker secretly amended bipartisan legislation after agreement, potentially violating House rules and the foundational trust Congress requires to operate. Reporters swarmed members outside the chamber. Partisan lines held, but not completely. AOC praised Crockett openly. She didn't just accuse, she proved it. Accountability in real time. Moderate Republicans expressed alarm. Don Bacon elaborated, if these allegations are accurate, this is a serious breach of legislative trust. That's not partisan, that's about protecting Congress itself. By nightfall the damage was compounding. After a tense GOP conference meeting, Johnson issued a written statement regretting any impression of non-disclosure and welcoming review, careful wording that satisfied almost no one. Even Fox hosts questioned whether he had torpedoed his own credibility. Overnight polls were brutal. Johnson's approval plunged 14 points, 62% of independents and 41% of Republicans found Crockett's evidence concerning. Democrats prepared to force a vote on an investigative committee. Whispers grew that moderate Republicans were privately discussing whether Johnson could survive as Speaker. Crockett's star, meanwhile, rose overnight. Even conservative columnist Jonah Goldberg wrote, "Love her politics or not, Crockett just showed what real congressional oversight looks like, facts over noise." 3 days later, in a move that stunned Washington, 23 moderate Republicans joined Democrats to create the bipartisan special committee, passing 255 to 180, a direct rebuke to Johnson and a resounding validation of Crockett's approach. The committee was evenly split, chaired by moderate Republican Mike Turner with Jasmine Crockett named vice chair, an explicit acknowledgement of her role and a signal of her sudden influence. A week after that, the conservative Washington Examiner published additional corroborating texts between Johnson's staff and industry reps plotting how to weaken enforcement without alerting Democrats. Pressure became unbearable. In a closed-door conference, attendees said Johnson offered his most candid comments yet, "I made mistakes in managing the final bill. I believe the changes were necessary for implementation, but I should have been transparent with everyone involved. It wasn't enough." Trust, once shattered, does not easily reassemble. 2 weeks to the day after Jasmine Crockett's 5-minute floor speech, Republican Representative Ken Buck of Colorado became the first to publicly call for Speaker Johnson to resign. Trust, once lost, is nearly impossible to restore, Buck said. For the good of this institution and for effective governance, Speaker Johnson should step aside.